for a start. How to Fail is a really daft title for an incredibly successful podcast hosted by a very successful woman. Do you ever think of changing the name?
I don't, because when I started it, I felt like a failure, and it wasn't successful, and I wasn't successful in that sphere. And when I started it, I felt like a failure primarily in my personal life because I was 39 and single and recently divorced and all of that. And I just had a yearning to talk to other people about how they coped with failure and how they survived and what, if anything, they learned from it. And it was as big a surprise to me as it was to anyone that it's become mildly successful.
Everyone wants to be on it.
Apart from Fee Glover, I've asked her and she said no.
Did she?
Yeah.
Oh, you'll get her now. She's got something to plug.
You've been on it though, Jane.
Yes,
One of
I've
my
been
favourite
on.
ever episodes.
Oh, of course. What else can you say?
I thought yours was a lovely episode, actually. I'm going to add a note of sincerity there. I thought it was. It was
Do you know
really
why?
good.
Because Elizabeth's a really good interviewer. And but it's actually genuinely such a great idea, because everyone, however successful they might seem, nothing has been easy for anybody, really, has it?
Exactly. That's the idea behind it, is that vulnerability is the source of all true connection. That's a belief of mine. And also, if we see people that we might aspire to, or that we see them as sort of shimmering gods on the red carpet when they're going to their latest film premiere, they might seem quite far away from us and it might seem quite alienating. But actually, when you get into the bones of their story, it turns out that they've had lots of trials and tribulations to get there. I mean, obviously various people to varying degrees, but I find that a very democratic way of doing an interview. And it also makes it easier for me as the interviewer. I mean, thank you for your kind words, Jane. But I ask people in advance of coming on to come up with 3 failures in their life that they don't mind discussing. And often that choice is very instructive, because what people categorise as failure says a lot about them as a person. But it also means that the parameter is set for the interview. So I think people come feeling quite safe already.
Yeah.
And it means that we can have really intimate and open conversations. And I value that as a journalist.
Do you think you could have made it, and would it have been as successful 15 years ago?
Oh, what a great question. Look at this. It's like you're a pro. I've never been asked that before. Wait, so 15 years ago would be what? Early 2000s? Possibly not, actually. I think I got very lucky with my timing, and I didn't think it through. It wasn't some master plan strategy at all. I got in at the beginning of podcasts, and I also got in at a time when people were beginning to hear of legends like Brené Brown, and the idea of being more open about things going wrong was just starting to take hold. But I think in the early 2000s, what with the rise of social media, there was this insane period of time where Instagram and Facebook became places where we could curate visions of our own perfection.
Yeah.
And that was the selling point. And also when stars, quote unquote, broke down publicly, it never did their image any good. So I'm thinking of Britney Spears. So I actually just don't think in that era we would have been ready for it in the same way. And I certainly in that era was a print journalist doing a lot of interviews with celebrities about all of their successes. And there was a specific format to that. You know, you had to go in with a little potted biography, and then you had to say, and what was it like working with so-and-so? And they would say, oh, wonderful. And that was it. And that was the deal. Yeah. And you couldn't ever get anything more, I felt, authentic or real or honest.
So changing the subject slightly, though not entirely, watching Liz Truss yesterday, Fee and I felt something approaching sympathy. And I don't think sympathy's great if you start to feel it for a politician. Certainly not for a leader of a free country.
When she was sitting on the green leather in the House of Commons, when she came into that chamber, her body language could not have been more different to the kind of rambunctious bravura Liz Truss that we'd seen a couple of days before. And she just looked haunted. She really did look terrible. Is that a woman who's dealing well with a massive failure?
I would say no. I think that there's a lot going on here. I think that the broader failure is one of our political system, which we can get into another time. But that is a failure in the sense that she got elected to a role that arguably she wasn't ready for. And also that our system is so combative rather than collaborative. So even when you do something so disastrous, you have to front it out. There's this sense that you have to front it out and you can't possibly admit to having made mistakes. And even when she did offer a sort of half-hearted apology yesterday in a TV interview, I felt that it was quite a sort of passively expressed apology. It was sort of, I objectively feel one could be sorry if someone else had made mistakes. It was sort of that tenor.
Okay,
And I
yeah.
think the first step to dealing with failure and to learning from it is to have self-awareness of what's gone wrong.
But are we still at a stage where we expect more from women in roles like that? Boris Johnson, I can't remember. Did he ever say sorry?
I think you're totally right that we do expect more from women, and it's a much harder battle to win, because if you say sorry too much, then you might be accused of being overly emotive. And you're right that Boris Johnson just had this immense bravado that some people bizarrely found appealing.
But he did say sorry, didn't he? He offered one apology during Partygate at the beginning that was much criticised because I think people didn't feel it had authenticity behind it.
Okay.
And then another apology where people noted a proper sense of contrition.
So
But that
two
was
sorries, he said.
quite far down the road, I think. But he has said sorry. He was also famously sent to Liverpool to say sorry, wasn't he? Which I'm not sure back in the day
I'm
was
not sure
an
that any of
effective
us
apology.
in that city were all that
Accepted it.
have ever entirely come to terms with him. But anyway,
I've actually interviewed Liz Truss
yeah.
twice.
Oh, go on.
Once way back when I think she was a backbencher, but she was not one of the new influx of Tory MPs. And I interviewed her for The Observer, left-leaning newspaper. And I really liked her. And she seemed quite fizzy and interesting. And then the second time I interviewed her was when she was being touted as a successor to Theresa May. Remember Theresa May?
Well, some people say she might be making a comeback. Stand by for more later. Carry on.
It says a lot that I feel relieved at that prospect. But I interviewed her the second time when she was being touted as a possible prime ministerial contender the first time around. And I found it harder to warm to her, not because she was in any way unpleasant, but because she lacked a fundamental quality that makes me warm to people, which is introspection. And I think in order to be self-aware, you need to have introspection. And I don't know whether she was just very good at pretending she didn't have it for the purposes of a newspaper interview. But I remember there was a couple of things I asked her when the last time she cried was, classic journalist question. She said, oh, probably a film or something. And then she told me the story of how she met her husband and they went ice skating together and she fell over and I went gushily, oh, you fell at his feet? And she said, yes, I've always enjoyed winter sports. And it was quite hard to get a chink of humour out of her.
I'm with Liz here. I think you were just trying to inject a saccharine note of journo pap. And she just wasn't going for it. Good luck to her.
Saccharine note of journo pap. Is that your second album?
I think you're going to write something next year, we're writing it now, about friendship. Now,
Yes.
What inspired this? This is non-fiction.
It's non-fiction. First of all, I love being called a big guest. Thank you very much. I'm going to put that in my Twitter bio.
Huge.
It's non-fiction and it's a book called Friendaholic, Confessions of a Friendship Addict. And it's about my journey through friendship. And what prompted it was the pandemic, to be fair. And I think actually a lot of people underwent reevaluations of their friendships during that time because overnight our diaries cleared out and either we felt extremely lonely or we felt the blessed relief of having a few evenings in. And it was really about assessing where I'd gone wrong with friendships and how I'd said yes to too many encounters that should have just stopped at being friendly rather than making them into bona fide friends. And then how sometimes you get overwhelmed. There's a saturation point that comes from more and more connections. And because friendship isn't something that socially we're allowed to fail at, it's seen as a failure if a friendship ends. Whereas romantic relationships, part and parcel of that is that you'll probably have a few before you find someone that you want to settle down with. And so I realised that there wasn't a language to express some of the things that I was feeling and that I knew a lot of my closest friends were also feeling. And Friendaholic is an attempt to explore my addiction to friendship and also to provide a language of it.
Okay, do you think you are a good friend?
I think I'm a good friend in certain respects. And this is something that I've had to be really clear-eyed and honest about in the book. I think I'm a bad friend in the sense that I'm extremely conflict avoidant. I care too much what other people might think of me, and that makes me cowardly. And so sometimes I haven't faced up to the ends of friendships and I haven't said in black and white, or I haven't spoken to someone about why I feel our friendship is ending. And I have just fallen out of their lives, which might be called ghosting. And I feel really bad about that. But I think part of the reason that is the case is because there is a lack of vocabulary. and because we all feel ashamed if a friendship has in some way gone awry. And what I realised during the writing of the book is that friendships are not failures just because they end. They can have an incredibly meaningful impact on your life forever, even if they're not an active daily part of it. It's a bit like volcanoes. Volcanoes can be dormant, but they completely shape the landscape around them. And so I think I'm a good friend in that respect, in that I've realised that. And I think of my former friends with love. And I think I am relatively funny. I mean, maybe you two could disabuse me of that notion.
Just
And
plough on.
and I'm present. Like, if you need me, I will be there.
Yes, I was going to
definitely.
say that's the ultimate test, isn't it? I mean, I honestly think there are people I know I could ring at 3 o'clock in the morning. And actually, isn't that what would you regard as the biggest test of a friendship?
Well, so I've got this test which I inherited actually from somebody else, which is the M4 friend. Would you, when you're driving on your way to a really lovely weekend on the M4, if you got a phone call from somebody, would you just turn around and go back to help them? Would you take the call in the first place, and would you ruin your own weekend?
If it was safe to take it, I would.
Yes, okay. I mean, obviously not a U-turn on the M4 using the necessary slip roads, etc. But it's that kind of thing, isn't it? To be able to know that you would interrupt your own life, whatever you're doing, to go and help somebody else out and stay with them until they were okay. And I sometimes think as women, and men who are listening can really correct me about this, but I think we have such an expectation of those kind of friendships and finding lots of them that sometimes we're not hard enough with ourselves to kind of go, actually, I can only have 2 of those people across a whole lifetime. I can't expect everybody to become that, or for me to become that to them. I don't know whether men do the same thing. I think we collect friendship in a different way.
Well, I think that goes into that notion of shame and failure, because women, and this is a huge generalisation and therefore I'm sure inaccurate, but women generally speaking are meant to be friendly. They're meant to be pleasant and pliable and nice. And we're meant to be able to foster that sort of small talk and that communication at the school gates. And therefore it feels humiliating and shameful if we don't carry on friendships lifelong. And you're totally right that that's completely impractical. And there's a very famous scientist in this field called Robin Dunbar, who I'm sure you've heard of, who developed Dunbar's number, which is about how many
We'll
friends
certainly
we can actually
pretend we've
sustain.
heard of Robin.
I'll be honest and say no.
But he said this thing, he developed his theory and evolved it somewhat. He developed something called friendship layers. And in your innermost layer, you can have 5 people who are like the M4 people. It's a very privileged road to choose. There are other motorways do exist. But you have 5 of them. And if you fall in love and you have a long-term romantic relationship, or you have children, that will cost you 2 of those other relationships, which I thought was fascinating. Wow. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's just about how much time we actually have, and time is a finite resource. And that's, and the other thing that I realised about friendship is that we all have different ways of measuring it. So the M4 test is a great one. For me, my primary friendship metric is generosity of spirit. If someone thinks of me well, even if I don't get in touch with them all the time, even if I'm terrible on the phone, if they're thinking of me well and they know that I'm thinking of them well, that for me is true friendship, and we can pick up where we left off. Whereas some people really need the kind of face-to-face contact, and their metric of friendship is time. So it's really, and some it will be shared hobbies and book club. So it's really a question of finding out what your metric is.
Can we talk a little bit about the book you're writing for young people? I'm sure you have already written it. This is Philosophy for Teens. Is this out now, or is that the new year as well?
That's coming out in January.
January, a time when we all turn over a new leaf.
Well, exactly, we shouldn't
But
feel
also
the pressure of that.
a time when we have a lot of book tokens.
That's also true. I don't think the book token really exists anymore, does it? Anyway, I was just thinking how I often feel how grateful I am not to be 14, frankly.
Oh, me too.
Presumably, is that where you come from in terms of
Absolutely.
the toughness of it?
Yeah, so Philosophy is a book that I wrote for adults, which was a distillation of 7 failure principles that I came up with from having done 4 years now of the How to Fail podcast. And it's a reworking of that specifically for the teenage market, because I have 3 teenage stepchildren. And so I get a bird's eye view on how monumentally difficult it is to be an adolescent in today's society. Because not only are they the most tested generation we've ever had in terms of exams, but there is the inordinate pressure of peer groups on social media and feeling like you have to be living your best life and comparing yourself to gym girls or boys on TikTok. That's a huge amount that I never had to deal with, and I'm so grateful for. And so really this is meant to be an empowering, warm and practical guide as to how failures don't have to define you, but they can actually just be useful data acquisition for the future about who you really are.
Right. And you shouldn't feel pressure to have this. I mean, Instagram has its uses. I mean, I've bought a number of pairs of elasticated trousers that have been offered to me via that.
The trousers I'm wearing now
Mechanism.
were advertised to me on Instagram.
Were they? Okay.
And they
But-
are elasticated waists.
Well, Elizabeth, I would not have known, but thank you. But I mean, I'm a reasonably intelligent, mature woman. I get so exercised by the great time everybody else appears to be having on Instagram. And then I'll speak to the same person the next day, and it turns out their holiday was rubbish.
Yeah.
And they hadn't spoken to their husband for 3 days of it.
But don't you think it's really interesting what Elizabeth's done with the How to Fail podcast? Because it's put another horse in the race, hasn't it? Because we know that we've got all of that perfection search going on, and we're really hard on ourselves when we look at all of that. But your podcast people love, because it's the flip side of that. So we are managing to ride different horses. It's not all going to hell in a handcart. You just have to choose something different. We are capable of making that choice.
Definitely. And I think the important thing to remember when you're scrolling through social media is that you are comparing your insides to everyone else's outsides. So we know what neurotic messes we are inside our own messy heads, but we can't possibly fathom that person posting about her yoga retreat in Ibiza is also feeling like that, because we only have her outside projection to go on. And that's been a very useful thing for me to remember as well, plus the airplane mode function on your phone.
Yeah, just switch it off.